The most beautiful love story you will see today, Elon Musk and Clara. Before we begin, consider subscribing so these tender stories can keep arriving at just the right time. This story begins in 1992 when Elon Musk had just moved to the United States, searching for new opportunities and a place to call home. The morning light settled gently on the streets of Philadelphia, stretching over the cobblestones and brushing the facades of the brownstone homes with a quiet, golden touch. In one of these dignified buildings, with ivy creeping loyally along its brick exterior, lived Clara Whitmore, a woman known to some as a socialite, to others as an eccentric, but in truth, she was simply a soul adrift in the elegant rituals of the city, carefully evading the confines of expectation. Clara rose that morning as she often did, the silken sheets slipping from her shoulders, her chestnut hair cascading in soft waves down her back. The echoes of last night's unwanted date still lingered, a man whose conversation had been as dry as the martini he spilled. She had escaped that encounter with the finesse of someone well-practiced in the art of polite evasion. A faint smile tugged at her lips as she slipped into her camel-colored coat and wrapped a scarf around her neck, determined to reclaim her morning. By the time the city stirred awake, Clara was already stepping into Bailey Banks and Biddle on Chestnut Street. The jewelry store, still bathed in the hush of early hours, became her sanctuary. She didn't need to buy anything. She simply wandered, tracing her fingers lightly across glass displays, admiring the weight of time and beauty encased in gold and emerald. There, in the soft ticking of antique clocks, she found a momentary stillness. But the stillness unraveled quickly. When Clara returned to her building, fumbling through her purse for the keys she had forgotten, she sighed and pressed the brass buzzer. "Mrs. Fisher, it's me," she chimed with playful apology. The voice of her landlady, stern yet indulgent, crackled through. "Again, Miss Whitmore." As the lock released with a stubborn clank, Clara pushed the heavy door open. She had little time to dwell on her forgetfulness. Wednesdays were sacred to her. They belonged to her brother. She darted out again, wrapped now in purpose, heading to the edge of a city where the prison loomed, an austere building of stone and silence. Her weekly visits were a private ritual, one she told few about. Bart had once been her tether to childhood, but now he was her secret, her reason, her waiting heart. In the narrow hallway of the apartment building, her path intersected with someone new. He stood there, adjusting a modest box in his arms, the faintest sheen of travel dust on his jacket. Elon Musk, though she did not yet know his name, looked up at her with a bemused arch of his brow. "Lock yourself out again?" he asked, his voice carrying a restrained amusement. Clara tilted her head, her eyes sharp yet sparkling. "It's tradition. You must be new." "I just moved in." "Well, I'm Clara Whitmore." She extended her hand with a grace that seemed rehearsed, but wasn't. "Elon." Their handshake lingered a breath too long, curiosity passing between them like a quiet wind. She offered him a knowing glance before vanishing down the stairwell, leaving the scent of her lavender perfume trailing behind. Later that day, Clara caught sight of Elon again, this time from her window. He was speaking with an older man, his posture a complex dance between patience and guarded distance. His father, she presumed. The exchange was formal, tinged with an undercurrent of something Clara could not yet name. As evening draped itself over the city, the glow from Clara's apartment spilled softly into the hallway. Elon, drawn by the low hum of music and the occasional bursts of laughter, found himself standing at her door. "You didn't strike me as the quiet type," he remarked, leaning against the frame. "Come in then," she said, her voice inviting but measured. Inside, her home unfolded like a tapestry, shelves of books, scattered trinkets from forgotten travels, photographs where faces smiled with distant memories. Clara moved with the elegance of someone accustomed to filling spaces with life, yet tonight there was a particular softness about her. She told him, in that tender hush reserved for rare confidences, about her brother Bart. about the money she had been quietly saving, piece by careful piece, to offer him a chance at something better when his sentence was done. Elon listened, not out of obligation but out of genuine attention. He admired the deliberate way she folded pain into her sentences without letting it consume her. The next afternoon, a small package arrived for Clara, wrapped in the understated way of someone who cared but did not yet know how to say it aloud. Inside, she found a fine fountain pen and an inkwell, the deep blue ink whispering of promises yet unwritten. Her heart paused, a fragile flutter beneath her ribs. By Friday evening, Clara's apartment had transformed into one of her renowned gatherings, rooms lit with soft chandeliers, the scent of aged wine and wildflowers weaving through the air. Elon, somewhat reluctant but quietly intrigued, stepped into her world of vibrant strangers and elegant excess. Claudia Stein, Clara's agent, circled him with the curiosity of someone always hunting for stories. "So you're the new neighbor," she smiled, not missing the way Clara's gaze softened whenever it drifted toward him. Amid the sparkling glasses and rising laughter, Vera, Clara's dearest friend, pulled her aside, her expression strained. "Why didn't you tell me?" "About the treatments," Vera whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of betrayal. Clara, cornered by kindness, offered a lie instead of the crueler truth. "I'm fine, Vera. It's just fatigue." But fatigue had not stolen the color from Clara's cheeks. Something else had. Still, she chose the lie, because the truth would unravel too many people, too quickly. Elon, observing from across the room, caught the tremble in Clara's hand as she lifted her glass, the flicker of shadows behind her practiced smile. Before the evening closed, Clara introduced Elon to two men of consequence, Martin Caldwell, a theater producer known for his influence, and Luca Benedetti, a composer whose melodies Clara often played when she couldn't sleep. There, in that room brimming with art and ambition, Elon found himself inexplicably woven into Clara's tapestry, a thread she had neither planned nor resisted. And somewhere beneath the music and the murmurs, the delicate machinery of their lives had already begun to turn. The sharp knock at Elon's door that morning was unexpected, though the weight behind it was strangely familiar. When he opened it, his father stood there, not with the coldness that usually marked their exchanges, but with something far more disconcerting, concern. "May I come in?" the elder Musk asked, his gaze flickering toward the hallway, as if to ensure they would not be overheard. Elon stepped aside, gesturing wordlessly. His father walked in, his hands clasped behind his back in that habit of containment, as though every gesture needed to be controlled. "I've been watching her," his father began without delay. "Clara Whitmore. She is unconventional. She draws people into her orbit, but she's drifting, Elon. Untethered. People like that tend to vanish." Elon bristled. "I can look after my own life." His father's voice softened, but it carried a warning. "You're not careful when you're curious. I've seen it before. Curiosity becomes something else." Before Elon could respond, the doorbell buzzed. He crossed the apartment with brisk steps, only to find a stranger waiting, an impeccably dressed man, his posture rigid, his jaw set. "Henry Whitmore," the man announced, his voice clipped. "I've come for my wife." Elon's confusion narrowed into something sharp. "Your wife?" Henry's glance swept past him, landing somewhere deeper in the apartment. "Clara. Where is she?" Elon found Clara in the stairwell moments later. The look on her face as she saw Henry was not fear nor longing, it was weariness. "I should have known he'd come," she murmured. Elon watched as she stepped toward Henry, as though returning a borrowed item rather than confronting a chapter of her life. Their conversation unfolded like a private play, but Clara's words echoed with finality. "Henry, the annulment was final. You know that." Henry's shoulders stiffened. "Come home. California is still your home." Her answer came like a soft sigh. "No, Henry, it isn't." She turned to Elon, her eyes momentarily glazed with something unspoken. She walked away from both men, her decision as firm as the sound of her heels striking the stairs. That evening, as though brushing off the heaviness of the day, Clara invited Elon to a jazz nightclub tucked in a quiet corner of the city. The music poured over them, thick and golden, as Clara leaned across the table, her fingers dancing along the edge of her glass. "I think I might marry Martin Caldwell," she announced suddenly, her tone unnervingly light. Elon's brow creased. "Caldwell? The theater producer?" "He offers stability," she said with a shrug, though her voice trembled just enough to betray her. "I've grown tired of drifting." The words landed between them like a stone in still water. It was later, when Elon found an old short story in a forgotten literary journal, that the threads began to tighten. The heroine's name was not Clara, but her mannerisms were hers: the lilting walk, the refusal to stay in one place too long, the half-truths offered like gifts. The author had written about a woman he'd encountered briefly, a woman who never stayed long enough to be caught. Clara had inspired someone else's fiction, it seemed. Elon felt the peculiar ache of realizing he was not the first to chase her shadow. And then, the next morning, the newspaper made its casual cruelty known. A crisp headline announced Martin Caldwell's engagement, not to Clara, but to Vera. Vera, Clara's dearest friend. The betrayal was public, but Clara said nothing. She folded the newspaper once, then again, pressing the sharp creases with methodical patience. "Would you like to leave the city today?" Elon asked quietly. Clara's answer was a wordless nod. They spent the day adrift through Philadelphia, walking aimlessly, feeding pigeons near the art museum steps, sharing hot pretzels from street cart, laughing with a kind of fragile, borrowed joy. In the sanctuary of Bailey Banks and Biddle, Elon led her to the corner where the mechanical toy machine sat, half forgotten. With a few coins, he turned the crank until the little ring popped out, a simple trinket, a child's prize. Yet when he slipped it onto her finger, the gesture shimmered with playful sincerity. "It's perfect," she whispered, the faintest blush rising on her cheeks. That night, they returned to her apartment, where the city's heartbeat seemed to quiet for them alone. The walls, once filled with distant laughter and the scattered echoes of other lives, now pulsed with something far more intimate. In the hush between midnight and dawn, they reached for each other, not in hurried desperation, but with reverent, aching tenderness. A quiet surrender. But in the morning, Elon awoke to sunlight falling on an empty bed. She was gone. On the small table near the window, the toy ring sat carefully placed, as if it belonged to a life she no longer had permission to keep. His breath caught. He stood by the window, the city alive beneath him, and understood what he had not dared admit. He had fallen in love with her, impossibly and completely. That day, he sought out his father. "Whatever arrangement we had, it's finished," Elon said with a finality that surprised even himself. "I can't be part of your plans anymore." His father's gaze, cool and expectant, did not waver. "Because of her?" "Yes." His father's sigh carried the weight of disappointment, but Elon no longer needed his approval. Meanwhile, Clara's own world unraveled. The letter arrived with clinical precision. Her brother Bart was gone, fallen in service. No details, no comfort, just the blunt architecture of grief. Her breath crumbled inside her. She read the letter once, then again, as if repetition could soften its blow. Bart had been her reason, her compass. Without him, the ground beneath her trembled. The walls of her apartment seemed to tilt, and for the first time, the weight of her drifting life became unbearable. She pressed her forehead against the cool glass of her window, tears tracing the delicate freckles on her skin, and whispered into the silence that Bart had once filled. Her world, once so meticulously constructed with half-truths and fleeting joys, had cracked open. And the question that lingered, fragile and trembling, where would she go now? The apartment that had once pulsed with Clara's vibrant energy now stood hollow, stripped of its color and clutter, reduced to bare walls and the echo of forgotten laughter. Cardboard boxes lined the floor, sealed and labeled with hasty scrawls. Clara moved briskly, folding away the last of her scarves, her fingers pausing for a beat too long on a silk one that still carried the faint scent of her perfume. Argentina. Luca Benedetti's invitation had arrived like an escape hatch, and she was determined to seize it. Buenos Aires promised a rhythm that might outpace her memories, a place where she could start over, away from collapsing bridges and entanglements she could no longer outrun. Elon had not seen her that morning, nor the one before. She had left no note. But the city had its own way of revealing secrets. It was Claudia Stein, disheveled and pale, who first burst into Elon's apartment, waving a crumpled piece of paper. "Clara's in jail," she stammered, breathless. The police picked her up at the docks. Elon's blood froze. "What? Why?" "Vinnie Bellucci," Claudia whispered, her voice trembling under the weight of implication. "They're accusing her of running messages for him, of knowing too much." "That's impossible." Elon's voice cracked. Claudia's eyes, wide with fear, held a truth neither could easily dismiss. "It doesn't matter. They've made the arrest. I've already paid her bail. She's waiting." The next moments unfolded in a blur, Elon rushing down the stairs, hailing the nearest taxi with a frantic wave. The city, usually a familiar hum, now thundered around him, each red light an unbearable delay, each turn a tightening coil in his chest. When he reached the station, Clara was waiting outside, arms crossed, her suitcase leaning against the curb like a silent accomplice. Her eyes met his with a flicker of surprise, quickly masked by the familiar guard she wore when emotions pressed too close. "I was about to call a cab," she said, her voice distant. "I'm here," Elon answered simply, as though those two words could bridge the widening gap between them. Clara gestured toward the street. "I'm still going. Luca's waiting. Argentina doesn't ask questions." The ache that lodged in Elon's throat nearly silenced him, but he spoke raw and unguarded. "Don't go. Stay. Stay with me." Her gaze faltered for a heartbeat, but she quickly stepped back. "Don't make this harder than it is. I was never built for permanence." "You don't have to be," he pleaded. "You just have to be here." Clara's hand trembled as she reached for her suitcase, her deflection quick, like muscle memory. "I can't. You don't understand. They'll keep chasing me. I'm not safe here." Elon's voice rose, desperation bleeding into his words. "I love you, Clara." The street seemed to hush around them, but she shook her head, refusing the tenderness he offered. "No, you don't. You love the version of me you've created. The Clara who lingers in doorways, who laughs at midnight. The real me, you'd tire of her." Without warning, she bent down and unlatched the crate beside her. Dog, the scruffy terrier who had been her silent companion, bolted out and darted into the street. "Elon, don't," she began, but he was already chasing the dog through the maze of parked cars and startled pedestrians. Her heart hammered as she watched him vanish around the corner, the weight of what she had done sinking in. Letting go had been her shield, her practiced exit, but this reckless kindness he carried shook the walls she had so carefully built. Without thinking, she dropped her suitcase and sprinted after them, her breath ragged as she called out, "Dog! Elon!" Elon caught sight of the terrier just as it squeezed beneath a fruit vendor's cart. He dove to his knees, extending his hands slowly, softly, whispering the dog's name like a secret. "Come on, boy. Let's go home." Dog hesitated, then shuffled forward, pressing into Elon's arms. When he turned, Clara was there, barefoot now, her shoes abandoned in the street, her chest rising and falling in frantic rhythm. Tears shimmered in her hazel eyes, their flecks of green and amber bright beneath the weight of realization. She approached carefully, as if afraid her next step might undo everything. "Elon," she breathed, her voice catching. "You came after me, even after I ran." He rose, dog cradled against his chest, and met her gaze. "I would always come after you." Her walls crumbled, not in some grand cinematic collapse, but quietly, like the last pages of a letter she never meant to finish. Clara took the dog from his arms, her fingers brushing his in the smallest of touches that somehow carried the weight of all she had resisted. "I don't want to go," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't want to keep running." "Then stay," he said gently. We'll figure it out. We'll build something that holds." For the first time, Clara allowed herself to believe it. They began walking back toward the apartment, side by side, the noise of the city slowly dissolving into something softer. Clara's hand slipped into Elon's, tentative at first, then sure, as if anchoring herself to this new promise. Dog trotted ahead of them, unaware of the history rewritten in his wake. There was no parade, no applause, only the quiet certainty of two people who had chosen, deliberately and against the pull of their pasts, to walk forward together. The apartment awaited, no longer a stopover, but a home in the making. As they disappeared into the rhythm of the street, a tender, hopeful beginning stirred between them, fragile yet undeniable, whispering that some lives, no matter how frayed, could still be rewoven. Life, when allowed to breathe without haste, has a way of gently reshaping itself. For Clara and Elon, the frantic collisions of their beginnings soon softened into a quiet rhythm, a paging forward where their lives no longer danced in parallel, but slowly folded into one another, thread by deliberate thread. Clara settled into this new chapter as though stepping barefoot onto unfamiliar ground. She unpacked her boxes with Elon by her side, his quiet presence a steadying anchor as she arranged her books and photographs, not as tokens of passing places, but as pieces of a home she was finally choosing to build. The walls of her apartment, once a revolving backdrop of fleeting encounters, now echoed with something sturdier. Elon helped her hang a small painting above the fireplace, and the act, though simple, left a tender weight in the room, a mutual declaration of permanence. Clara, who once drifted through the city as though no place could hold her, began to move differently. Her steps felt less hurried, her gaze lingered longer on familiar streets. She returned to Bailey Banks and Biddle with a quiet reverence now, strolling past the glittering displays with no need to escape or prove anything. Sometimes Elon accompanied her, their hands brushing in passing. Other times she went alone, savoring the peace she had long mistaken for restlessness. One late afternoon, Clara stepped onto her fire escape just as the sun stretched low across the rooftops. Her voice, soft but certain, rose above the clatter of the city as she began to sing Fields of Gold. The melody drifted gently, weaving through the street like a golden thread. Passers-by paused, some smiling, some closing their eyes as if to carry the moment with them. Elon, listening from a doorway, marveled at the quiet grace of it, that she now sang for the simple joy of being heard, not to be chased or adored, but simply to exist fully in her own song. Neighbors began to notice. The once elusive Clara Whitmore now lingered in conversations, stopped to pet dogs, and greeted the grocer by name. There was a softness to her days now, a rootedness that had quietly taken hold. Elon, too, found his world reshaped. He began sketching the framework for new ventures, companies that no longer chase prestige, but instead reach towards something meaningful. Projects that reflected Clara's boldness and unpredictability, her refusal to follow neat lines. He spoke often of creating things that would last beyond profit, things that might carry human stories into the future. Together, they built small rituals, a shared newspaper in the mornings, the gentle competition of crossword puzzles, walks through Washington Square Park where Dog trotted faithfully at their heels. They dreamt aloud now, not in hesitant fragments, but in full, sprawling sentences. Their love deepened quietly, growing not in grand declarations but in trust, the steady kind that knits itself into daily life. Elon found himself leaning on her counsel, seeking her laughter, when the weight of ambition pressed too tightly on his shoulders. One morning, Clara arrived at the local shelter, the same one where she had abandoned Dog in a moment of chaotic retreat. She completed the adoption papers, paid the overdue fines, and slipped her hand through the kennel door to offer Dog a biscuit and a whispered apology. When she brought Dog home, Elon's face broke into the widest smile she'd ever seen. "You forgave him," he said softly. Clara pressed a kiss to the top of Dog's head. "I think he forgave me first." Their lives soon threaded into the city's social fabric, attending galas and quiet dinners as a pair, no longer drawing curious stares, but soft nods of approval. Clara, once elusive, now stood confidently at Elon's side, unguarded and fully present. There were moments when her past resurfaced, letters from old acquaintances, whispered rumors about Bellucci's circle, but Clara no longer ran from them. She addressed what needed addressing, returned what needed returning, and stood tall in rooms she once fled from. Gradually, she began to let go of the vestiges of her former life, the extravagant parties, the superficial alliances, the need to always be elsewhere. She sold the silk dresses she no longer wore, donated the trinkets that belonged to a Clara who drifted through borrowed spaces. One evening, as the setting sun painted the sky in lavender and gold, Elon's father joined them for dinner. His approval was not offered in words, but in the faint, rare smile that touched his lips as he watched Clara and Elon clear the table together, their movements easy, their glances soft. After dinner, he stepped onto the balcony with Elon. "She's good for you," he said, almost to himself. "You've steadied each other." Elon nodded, his heart full. "We've built something neither of us expected." The sense of impermanence that had once shadowed Clara's every step now seemed to dissolve, replaced by the sturdy architecture of a life chosen, one morning at a time, one shared silence at a time. In the tender hush of their evenings, as they sipped tea by the window and listened to the city's softened heartbeat, it became clear to both of them they were no longer waiting for life to begin elsewhere. They had found it here, in the quiet spaces they filled together. A home not defined by walls, but by presence. And for the first time, neither of them wished to be anywhere else. It was Clara's idea to leave the city for a while. Just a weekend, nothing extravagant, just far enough from the familiar streets and the lingering ghosts of Philadelphia's past. She suggested it on a quiet morning over coffee, her voice light, but with a glimmer of something deeper. "A small cottage," she said, tracing the rim of her cup. "Somewhere with trees. Somewhere we could hear ourselves think." Elon smiled, setting the newspaper aside. "Then let's go. Let's think. Let's get lost." They escaped to a modest stone cottage tucked near the edge of a pine forest where the scent of earth and morning dew filled the air. There, far from their carefully constructed lives, Elon began to see a new layer of Clara, one not gilded by the city's charm but softened by something beautifully ordinary. Clara knelt to tie the shoelaces of a neighbor's child who had wandered too far from his family during their walks. She gently wrapped a blanket around a stray cat left by the roadside. In these moments, Elon saw the faint outline of maternal instincts she had long kept buried, perhaps out of fear, perhaps out of disbelief that she was capable of such tenderness. She held Dog now with something more than affection. It was protection, a quiet promise to never let go again. "You'd be a good mother," Elon said one evening as they watched the fire flicker low. Clara's gaze wavered, her fingers pausing in Dog's soft fur. "I never thought I would be." "You already are," he murmured. Back in the city, Clara's influence wove steadily through Elon's work. He began to find his own voice in his ventures, less tethered to the heavy gaze of his father, more attuned to his own vision. When doubt crept in, Clara's confidence steadied him. "Trust yourself," she would say, her hazel eyes fierce and certain. "You've built cathedrals in your mind. Let the world see them." Together, they returned to Bailey Banks and Biddle, not as wanderers or playful intruders, but as a couple with a quiet, shared reverence. They lingered by the mechanical toy machine, where months before, Elon had given her the simple ring that still rested in a velvet box on her dresser. They smiled at the memory, at how far they had come from that hesitant beginning. It was there, among the glittering cases and soft ticking clocks, that Clara's guard slipped. "I'm afraid," she confessed, her voice barely above the hush of the store. "Afraid of loving like this. Afraid of losing it. Of losing you." Elon turned to her fully, his hand resting over hers. "I can't promise forever without storms, but I can promise I'll stay when they come." Something in Clara's posture softened, like a door long bolted finally easing open. In that moment they sealed their bond, not in the sweep of grand gestures, but in the quiet acceptance of each other's fragility. The commitment they made was not loud. It was not engraved in marble or toasted with crystal. It lived in small things, in the grocery lists written in both their handwriting, in the gentle tap of their shoes waiting side by the door. Their days bloomed into a tapestry of shared purpose. A montage unfurled, a new company's first blueprint spread across their kitchen table. Clara singing fields of gold softly to herself as she folded laundry. Elon sketching diagrams with dog's head resting on his foot, their laughter spilling into the quiet hum of midnight. Dog, once a symbol of Clara's fleeing heart, now nestled contentedly between them on the sofa, his small frame curled into the tender space where their arms met. He was no longer a burden of guilt, but a living, breathing thread in the fabric they wove together. Their love deepened again, but now with a different gravity. The hurried passion of their earlier nights gave way to something steadier, something that no longer asked for promises in haste, but understood that their permanence had already been quietly stitched into their days. In those moments, their bodies spoke not of conquest, but of home. Afterward, Clara lay with her head on Elon's chest, her smile soft, her gaze distant but peaceful. "I used to chase nights filled with champagne and music I couldn't remember," she whispered. "But I've stopped running. I like it here, this life. I like the sound of your heartbeat." Elon's hand drifted through her hair. "I like that you're staying." What surprised him most was the quiet shift within himself. He no longer needed his father's approval, nor his financial safety net. He began to draw the lines of his life without the shadow of inherited expectations. His father's influence, once suffocating, now receded like the tide. And Clara, who once measured her worth by how quickly she could disappear, now measured it by how much she wanted to stay. They left Bailey Banks and Biddle hand in hand that afternoon, their eyes bright with the kind of hope that no longer needed to hide behind half-spoken plans. They were building something, slowly, carefully, together. Their stolen moments, once scattered across Philadelphia like fragments, had now stitched themselves into a home. The creak of the apartment's old wooden floors, the soft clang of Clara's teacups, the rhythm of shared footsteps on familiar sidewalks, these things, once overlooked, now held their meaning. The city, too, seemed to embrace them in a quieter way. The fire escape where Clara once sang now bloomed with small potted herbs. The neighbors no longer watched her with curiosity, but with the quiet warmth reserved for those who had finally unpacked their suitcases. And so the first chapters of their story settled into place, not with fireworks or crowded rooms, but with a steady pulse of belonging. They were no longer searching for where they fit. They had built it together. Their days began to unfold with a rhythm neither of them had expected, a soft, steady routine that settled into the brownstone like sunlight creeping across a quiet room. Clara and Elon no longer moved through Philadelphia as wanderers or as separate stories. They had built something shared, something neither was in a hurry to escape. The apartment, once Clara's reluctant shelter, now bore the warm evidence of their life together. A pair of worn slippers by the door, half-read books left open on the arm of the sofa, dog's toys scattered across the rug like small, joyful interruptions. Each morning, as Elon read through his notes or sipped coffee by the window, Clara's voice would drift softly through the rooms. Fields of gold. She sang it without performance, without audience, just a quiet melody folding itself into the corners of their home. It became the pulse of their mornings, as familiar as the creak of the floorboards or the ticking of the kitchen clock. Elon had seen Clara wear many faces, charming, elusive, defiant, but now, in the sanctuary they had built, he glimpsed something far rarer, her true confidence. She moved through their shared space with a gentle certainty, her laughter unguarded, her silences no longer weighed down by fear. And yet, some fears lingered. One crisp afternoon, Clara surprised Elon with a simple declaration. "I've been working with the shelter," she said, gently rubbing Dog's ears. "I wanted to make it right, to make peace with how I let him go." Her honesty wrapped itself around Elon's heart. "You already did. He's home now, with us. But she shook her head softly. No, I need to know I would never do it again. Not to him, not to myself. Elon simply reached for her hand. I'll stand with you, wherever that takes you. As the days stretched forward, Clara began peeling back the final layers of her guarded heart. She spoke openly now of her fears, of loss, of not being enough, of the quiet terror that the life they had built might still slip through her fingers. Elon listened, not to fix her, but to know her. His compassion wasn't loud, nor was it rushed. He answered her trembling with steadfastness, his silence often saying more than his words. Their visits to Bailey Banks and Biddle became less about nostalgia and more about weaving new memories. They no longer lingered by the mechanical toy machine as a symbol of what was lost. Instead, they explored the quiet corners of the store together, Clara tracing the delicate patterns on silver frames, Elon holding out watches and laughing at their price tags. They weren't chasing meaning anymore, they were simply living it. The echoes of the past, however, still called. One overcast morning, Clara crossed paths with Vera near Washington Square. The encounter was not staged, but life, as it often does, had a way of placing unfinished stories directly in their path. Vera's surprise flickered into guarded distance. I thought you disappeared, she said, her voice a careful blend of hurt and self-preservation. Clara's reply came, without hesitation. I was running. For myself, mostly. But I was wrong to leave the way I did. Her apology was not dressed in excuses. It was quiet, genuine, and it reached Vera, who softened by a fraction. Are you happy now? Vera asked, her question carrying the weight of old, splintered hopes. I am, Clara answered, and I want that for you too. Their parting was not dramatic, nor was it final. It was simply honest, and perhaps that was enough. Not all from Clara's past welcomed her peace. Martin Caldwell reappeared one evening at a charity event Elon and Clara attended. His charm remained polished, but his smile now struck Clara as hollow. He spoke with the casual arrogance of someone who expected to be welcomed back. You've always belonged in the spotlight, he said smoothly. Come back to it. Clara's answer was firm, her voice steady. I've found something better. His confusion flickered briefly before he turned away, but Clara no longer carried the weight of his disapproval. She walked back to Elon, her steps light, her certainty solid. Elon, too, was quietly shedding his own entanglements. He stopped accepting calls from his father's advisors. He began funding his ventures independently, building a foundation no longer tethered to inherited power. One evening, they stood on the rooftop of their building, their fingers laced together as fireworks bloomed over the Philadelphia skyline. The night pulsed with color and possibility, and as Clara's head rested against Elon's shoulder, they spoke softly of future dreams. We could travel, Clara mused. Italy maybe, or the quiet towns along the French coast. And build, Elon added. Companies that mean something. Projects with real weight. Clara smiled at the simplicity of the vision. And home. Always home. Their life began to breathe more fully, painted in the soft hues of shared days. They spent nights in jazz clubs, Clara's laughter carrying over the hum of the saxophone. Elon watched her as if still discovering her, each smile, each note, each glance a new invitation. Inspired by her journey, Elon began building something different, a new website, one that told stories of resilience, of quiet courage, of finding home where you least expected. When he showed Clara the first draft, she read each word slowly, carefully, her fingers brushing the screen as if touching something fragile. These are my steps, she whispered, her throat tightening. But you made them beautiful. They were already beautiful, Elon said softly. In those quiet hours, curled together on the sofa with dog pressed between them, they realized that their bond had deepened beyond love. It had grown into partnership, into the steady heartbeat of friendship. They no longer lived in the echoes of what was, or the fragile hopes of what might be. They existed fully in what they had chosen, each other, this home, this life. And for the first time, neither of them looked back. It began with the smallest change, a new coat of paint in the entryway. Clara stood with her arms crossed, surveying the soft ivory walls that had grown tired over the years. "What if we open the space up?" she mused, her hazel eyes sparkling with something that hadn't always lived there, permanence. Elon, leaning against the doorframe, smiled gently. "Let's do it. Let's make it ours." What started as a whim became a season of quiet transformation. They spent weekends selecting fabrics, rearranging furniture, and peeling away the layers of a life Clara once refused to unpack. With each nail hammered, each box discarded, Clara built not just a home, but a future she no longer feared. One morning, Clara set the table for brunch, her hands moving with careful intention. She had invited Elon's father, a gesture that once would have seemed impossible. Elon raised an eyebrow when she told him. "I want to thank him," she said softly. "He shaped you. I want him to know I see that." The brunch was simple: warm croissants, fresh coffee, and the unspoken weight of old expectations. Elon's father arrived with his usual guarded air, but he softened as Clara welcomed him, not with performative charm, but with genuine gratitude. "Thank you," she told him quietly as they cleared the plates. "You raised a man who knows how to stay. That's no small thing." Elon's father gave a rare nod, his approval unspoken but understood. Clara no longer shied away from society's glare. When a high society fundraiser approached, a circle that once measured her worth in whispers and past mistakes, she chose to attend, this time with Elon at her side. As they entered the grand ballroom, the murmurs were immediate. Old acquaintances exchanged glances, their judgments lightly veiled behind champagne flutes. Clara stood taller, her hand anchored in Elon's. She didn't need to disappear this time. She didn't need to shrink. "We'll face them," Elon whispered, steady and close. "Together." And they did. The weeks settled into a tender rhythm. Dog, once a symbol of Clara's fear and guilt, had become a constant in their home life, curled at their feet during quiet evenings, perched on the windowsill watching the city breathe. His presence stitched comfort into their days. Still, some nights, Clara's voice trembled with a confession that clung stubbornly to her heart. "I'm afraid," she admitted as they folded laundry together. "Not of losing you, but of losing myself." Elon set the cotton shirt down carefully. "You won't. Not with me. Promise." He reached for her hand, his thumb brushing over the delicate lines of her palm. "I promise. I love all of you, even the parts you're still figuring out." Their evenings grew into a shared ritual. Elon began reading his writing aloud to Clara, his voice steady, his words raw. She listened with thoughtful silence, offering honest, gentle feedback, her insight sharpening his work in ways no editor ever had. "This part," she would say, pointing to a paragraph, "feels like you're still hiding." And Elon would nod, grateful, knowing she had become his truest compass. Together, they polished the stories that filled the website, tales of second chances, of quiet bravery, of building lives in the soft shadows of mistakes. Clara's fingerprints touched every page. To celebrate the gentle victories, they took another weekend trip, this time to the Pennsylvania countryside, where the pace of life slowed and the weight of expectation seemed to lift. There, Clara laughed with unguarded freedom, her head tilted back as the wind tangled through her hair. Elon watched her as if memorizing the exact shape of her joy. One evening, as the stars dusted the sky, they found themselves alone in a field, the hum of distant crickets their only audience. "Dance with me," Clara whispered, barefoot in the grass, her hand reaching for his. There, beneath the silent expanse of the heavens, they swayed, slow, aimless, content. There was no music but the rhythm of their hearts and the rustle of the night breeze. In the hush of their closeness, Elon shared a memory he had long kept buried, a childhood afternoon spent building a treehouse that never stood, his father too busy, his hands too small. "I thought if I could build something grand enough, he'd stop and see me," Elon said, his voice soft but steady. Clara's arms tightened around him. "I see you." When they returned to Philadelphia, they carried with them a quieter intimacy. The threads of their bond had woven deeper, stitched not only by passion but by trust, by friendship, by shared breath. Clara, once a woman who fled from permanence, now arranged a welcome home dinner, inviting friends into the space they had so carefully remade. Vera came, her laughter genuine this time, her forgiveness long since offered. Claudia Stein brought stories and wine. Even Elon's father attended, his presence no longer looming, but quietly supportive. The apartment filled with the warmth of easy conversation, the scent of home-cooked food, the flicker of candlelight. Clara moved through the room with effortless grace, no longer shadowed by who she had been. Elon caught her eye across the table. She smiled, not the brittle, polished smile of a woman performing, but the soft, luminous one that only he knew. They had not sought to become a spectacle. They had simply built a life, one tender brick at a time. And as they lingered in the glow of their gathering, surrounded by friends, by laughter, by the simple act of staying, they realized they had arrived, not at an ending, but at something quietly, beautifully whole. When Elon closed his laptop that afternoon, his breath caught, not from exhaustion, but from the quiet, startling satisfaction of completion. After months of drafting, revising, and nights spent reading aloud to Clara, his website was finally ready. It wasn't just a collection of words. It was a reflection, a living archive of resilience, second chances, and all the quiet corners where love had taken root. Clara, perched on the edge of the sofa with dog curled by her feet, watched him with growing anticipation. When he finally looked up, she sprang to her feet and wrapped her arms tightly around his shoulders. "You did it," she whispered, her voice brimming with sincerity. "You built something that matters." Elon laughed softly into her hair. "I couldn't have done it without you." "Of course you could have," she teased, stepping back to meet his gaze, her hazel eyes gleaming. "But I'm glad you didn't." Together, they began exploring advertising options, mapping out possibilities and partnerships over late-night coffee and quiet jazz. Elon's ambition was tempered now, not driven by urgency, but by thoughtful precision. Clara, steady as ever, offered him unwavering encouragement. "Take your time," she reminded him gently. "Let it grow the right way." While Elon pushed his project forward, Clara began reaching backward to friends from her former life who had only known her as the woman forever moving, forever halfway out the door. When she reconnected with Vera, there was no awkwardness, only the tender acknowledgement of time passed and growth earned. "I almost didn't recognize you," Vera said with a soft laugh, sipping tea across from Clara in their favorite corner cafe. "I barely recognize myself," Clara admitted, not with regret, but with something resembling peace. These meetings stitched a quiet redemption into Clara's story, each one a testament to the self she had worked hard to uncover. One evening, as the shadows lengthened in their apartment, Elon carefully broached the subject she rarely ventured near, her lingering fears from the past. "You've forgiven everyone else," he said, his voice tender. "But have you forgiven yourself?" Clara paused, her gaze fixed on the gentle sway of dog's tail by the window. "I don't know," she said softly. "Sometimes I still feel like I'm waiting to be chased out of this life." Elon reached for her hand, his thumb tracing slow, reassuring circles over her skin. "You're not running anymore. You've already stayed. You built this." Her walls, so long fortified, began to crumble beneath the gentle weight of his words. Later that week, they wandered again through Bailey Banks and Biddle. It had become a quiet ritual, their secret temple. They no longer needed the place for answers, but they found comfort in retracing their steps, seeing their story reflected in the shop's unchanged displays. "Do you remember how uncertain I was here?" Clara asked, trailing her fingers along a silver picture frame. Elon smiled, his arm brushing hers. "I remember that you stayed." They had not outrun their past. They had walked through it. That night, as rain tapped softly against the window panes, Clara finally opened the last door she had long left closed. She spoke of her father, a man whose silence had shaped her childhood in California, whose absence she had once tried to outrun by filling her life with noise and movement. "He taught me to disappear," she confessed, her voice trembling. to leave before I was left." Elon's heart ached as he listened, but he did not interrupt. He let her story spill out, her words finding their place at last. When she finished, he pressed a kiss to her temple and simply said, "You're here now, and I see you." The following weekend, their apartment bloomed with quiet celebration. A small circle of friends gathered for a private reading. Elon's website, the culmination of his journey, spoken aloud in the home they had built together. Clara sat near him, her hand resting gently on his knee, her expression soft and glowing. As Elon read, his voice gained strength, carrying the weight of stories that once felt too fragile to share. When he finished, Clara's tears fell freely, tears of pride, of relief, of a heart finally unburdened. "You found your voice," she whispered, cupping his face, "and you filled it with truth." With his newfound confidence, Elon continued to expand his work, but his world no longer revolved solely around his projects. He found joy in Clara's evolving path, too. She had begun teaching music part-time at a local community center, guiding children whose bright eyes reminded her of the girl she once was, the one who still believed in the magic of melody. Elon attended her first recital, sitting quietly at the back as Clara encouraged hesitant hands and trembling voices. When she glanced toward him, his warm applause met her like a steady heartbeat, a silent vow. Their partnership deepened as they found new ways to create together. On quiet evenings, Clara read poetry aloud while Elon accompanied her on the cello, their rhythms weaving in and out, a delicate conversation without the need for words. Their combined talents caught the attention of a local journalist who attended one of their impromptu performances. The article that followed described them as a pair who build their art the way they built their life, slowly, sincerely, with both hands open. The attention surprised them, but they met it with humility, always returning to the quiet, steady life they had crafted in their brownstone. Together, they had built something richer than either of them had imagined. Their days now held layers: music, writing, shared meals, the soft thump of dogs' paws on the floor, the laughter that filled even the smallest corners of their home. The life they lived was not grand by the standards of the world, but to them it was precious, each moment a deliberate stitch in a tapestry that would not easily unravel. And as they sat by the window one late afternoon, watching the golden light spill over the rooftops, Elon glanced at Clara and thought, with quiet certainty, this is where the gold has always been. The email arrived on a gray morning, its subject line simple but life-altering: Web Development Contract Approved. Elon read it twice, his heart blooming with a quiet, almost disbelieving joy. It wasn't just about the contract, it was what it represented. Trust in his work, belief in his voice, a step forward that belonged entirely to him. Clara found him still at the table, the glow of his laptop illuminating the soft curve of his smile. "What's happened?" she asked, a playful lilt in her voice as she set a steaming cup of tea beside him. Elon looked up, eyes bright. "I've been offered the contract." Clara didn't jump or cheer loudly. She simply leaned in and wrapped her arms around his shoulders, pressing her cheek to his temple. "Of course you have," she whispered. "You've built something real." Their celebration was tender quiet, a bottle of sparkling lemonade shared over a simple dinner, dogs snuggled between them on the worn sofa. No grand gestures were needed. The moment was already perfect. In the days that followed, Clara turned her attention to their home, designing a reading corner near the large front window. She filled it with soft cushions, a low bookshelf, and a vintage reading lamp that cast a golden glow over the afternoon light. It became her sanctuary, a place where they would sit together, often in silence, wrapped in shared stories and peaceful company. The community center where Clara taught music soon invited them to an appreciation event honoring their quiet contributions. They hadn't sought recognition, but their steady presence had rippled outward, touching lives in small but lasting ways. At the ceremony, Clara's voice trembled with emotion as she addressed the crowd. "I used to think I was meant to drift through life," she began, her hazel eyes shining. "But I found a home, in music, in this community, and in someone who never let me disappear." She glanced at Elon, her heart full. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft but sure, "for being the place I could stay." Elon, when it was his turn to speak, found his words flowing more easily than he had ever expected. "Clara saved me from building walls I thought I needed. She taught me to stay soft, to build with care. I stand here today because she stood beside me." The applause felt like sunlight on skin. Not long after, they attended Elon's contract signing together, walking side by side into a polished Philadelphia office. Clara's hand brushed his as they crossed the marble floor, her steady presence anchoring him as always. Elon's client, a thoughtful woman named Teresa Langford, extended her hand to Clara with genuine warmth. Within minutes, the two women were laughing, finding common ground as if they had known each other for years. As they left the office, the city buzzing softly around them, Clara tucked her arm through Elon's. "Doesn't it feel different now?" she asked. He nodded. "It feels like ours." Their walks home were filled with dreaming, of traveling, of seeing places they had only spoken of in passing. Elon's website was now live, quietly gaining attention, its stories resonating with readers who found comfort in its sincerity. One evening, as the sky melted into soft pinks and golds, Clara confessed what Elon had long suspected. "I think I'm ready," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "To build something steady, to believe in a future that doesn't scare me." Elon's answer came days later, in the form of 2 crisp plane tickets he carefully tucked beneath her breakfast plate. "Rome," she gasped, lifting them with trembling fingers. "You once said you wanted to get lost in its streets," he smiled. "I thought we could find them together." They didn't rush to pack. They lingered in the sweetness of anticipation, savoring each step of preparation as if they had all the time in the world. At night, Dog curled beside Elon as he finished the final edits on his website, the comforting sound of Clara humming fields of gold drifting from the kitchen. The song, once a symbol of longing, now wrapped itself around their days like a soft, familiar thread. As they folded clothes into suitcases and carefully zipped them shut, Clara paused, her hand resting on the fabric. "This feels different," she murmured. "I'm not packing to escape this time." Elon smiled, gently cupping her face. "We're not running. We're simply beginning something new." Their love, once delicate and hesitant, had now stretched beyond their apartment walls, quietly touching the lives of those around them, through the website, through music, through the small, steadfast ways they showed up for each other and their community. The city that had once felt like a temporary refuge now felt like home, a place where they had written their own rhythm, their own slow, tender story. As they stood by the window one last time before leaving for the airport, watching the Philadelphia skyline bathed in morning light, Elon softly whispered, "We've built something good, haven't we?" Clara's smile was radiant, steady. "We've built something golden." And as they stepped into the next chapter, bags in hand, hearts wide open, their story continued, quietly, beautifully, and entirely their own. The Rome sky stretched wide and impossibly blue as the plane touched down, the hum of the engines slowly fading beneath the quiet thrum of Clara's heartbeat. Beside her, Elon's fingers gently laced through hers, steady, familiar, the same way he had held her through every season of their shared story. This trip was not just a celebration, it was a quiet triumph. The launch of Elon's website had found wings, and now they had come to Rome to honor it, to mark the beginning of something they had once only whispered about. Their first morning unfolded with soft steps along the Tiber River, its silver surface shimmering in the gentle Italian sun. Clara's laughter floated easily as she leaned against Elon's shoulder, the memory of Philadelphia's streets still warm in their minds. "Do you remember when we used to walk home from Bailey Banks and biddle in the snow?" she asked, her voice brushing the air like a song. Elon smiled, his gaze soft as the river's current. "We used to walk like we didn't know where we were going. Now we do." The convention hall in Rome buzzed with a quiet anticipation that made Elon's heart beat a little faster. The invitation to speak had come unexpectedly, but Clara had insisted he accept. "You built this," she had reminded him. You deserve to stand in it. On stage, Elon's voice, once hesitant, now held its own cadence, its own weight. He read excerpts from his website, stories of resilience, of love reclaimed, of the quiet strength that had built his home, his life. He read not to impress, but to share, to reach across the silence and offer something true. From the crowd, Clara's smile shone like morning light, her hazel eyes brimming with unspoken pride. In her gaze, Elon found the courage to keep reading, to keep believing that his voice mattered. After the reading, a group of investors approached them, their interest genuine, their questions thoughtful. They spoke not just of business, but of connection, how the honesty of the website had drawn them in, how the human stories had made them linger. Elon listened, grateful and a little stunned, but when they thanked him, he gently shook his head. "It wouldn't exist without her," he said, glancing toward Clara. "She's the reason I ever dared to write. She's the reason I stayed." He turned fully to Clara, his voice soft but firm. "She is my muse. She is the story." A nearby reporter, who had been quietly observing, approached them soon after, captivated by what she called the story behind the story. As they spoke, it became clear that the reporter wanted to write about more than Elon's website. She wanted to write about their love, a love that had stitched itself together through patience, through fear, through the soft, persistent choice to stay. Clara hesitated, not out of vanity, but because her life had so often been made of doors she had closed too quickly. Elon's hand found hers. "It's our story. Let them see what we've built." And so they told it, not perfectly, not grandly, but with the steady tenderness that had defined them from the beginning. Their days in Rome became a soft collage of simple joys. They wandered through the narrow streets, their hands forever entwined, pausing to share gelato by the fountains, to watch the late sun spill over the ancient stone. One afternoon, they lingered beneath the bell tower of a quiet piazza, their footsteps slow, their hearts steady. "We're not running anymore," Clara whispered. "We're home," Elon agreed. When they returned to Philadelphia, the city welcomed them like an old friend. But before they returned fully to their familiar rhythm, they made one more stop, a symbolic pilgrimage to Bailey Banks and Biddle, the place where their story had quietly begun. The shop had not changed. The gentle chime of the door, the warm hush of morning light on glass displays, the faint ticking of antique clocks, all still there. Clara traced her fingers along the mechanical toy machine where Elon had once retrieved a simple plastic ring for her. "Do you remember?" She laughed, her voice rich with nostalgia. "I thought you were out of your mind." Elon leaned in, pressing a soft kiss to her cheek. "I was. I still am for you." In that moment, the weight of gratitude settled in his chest, deeper than words could carry. They had survived themselves, their ghosts, their hurried exits, and fragile beginnings. They had stayed. Back in their apartment, the walls now filled with memories, with music, with the soft presence of dogs sleeping lazily by the window, they unpacked slowly, savoring the rhythm of home. Plans began to form around them like unfolding petals, community events, quiet press gatherings, invitations to share not just Elon's work, but the story that lived behind it. People wanted to hear about the life that had been quietly built on ordinary streets, about the couple who had stitched their way back to themselves. Clara and Elon didn't seek the spotlight, but when it found them, they faced it as they had faced everything else, together, steady, hand in hand. Their love, once so delicate it had trembled beneath its own weight, now stood firm, an example of healing, of choosing each other in the quiet spaces where no one else was looking. It was not a perfect love, but it was theirs. And as they sat together in their reading corner that evening, the soft light of the vintage lamp warming their faces, Clara leaned into Elon's side, her voice a soft hum of fields of gold threading through the silence. Elon listened, his hand gently stroking dog's fur, and thought of how far they had come, from lonely hallways to cobbled streets in Rome, from hesitant glances to steady, unshakable devotion. Love had not saved them. They had saved each other. Elon had never imagined he would find such quiet satisfaction in routine. His mornings now held a steady rhythm, coffee brewing in the small kitchen, dog's paws clicking softly across the wooden floor, the warm hum of his laptop opening as he began his work as a web developer. It wasn't glamorous, but it was his, and it brought a kind of peace that ambition alone never could. Clara often joined him at the table, humming softly, sometimes reading, sometimes simply watching the way sunlight threaded through the lace curtains. Their life had settled into something gently predictable, but it never felt stagnant. It felt earned. Each week, their brownstone filled with the laughter and soft voices of friends. What began as the occasional dinner soon became a cherished tradition. Thursday evenings spent sharing meals, telling stories, and building something Elon had quietly longed for: community. Bailey Banks and Biddle, the shop that had marked so many of their beginnings, became their place of celebration. Whenever something good happened, a milestone at work, a new friend welcomed, or simply the small victories of daily life, they would stop in, not always to buy, but to remember, to mark how far they had come. One Thursday, Clara finally wove Elon fully into her circle. Vera, whose friendship had survived years of distance, Claudia Stein, whose sharp humor belied her deep loyalty, and surprisingly Martin Caldwell, still on the periphery of their story. Martin's presence was not a threat, but a quiet echo of what Clara had left behind. She greeted him with kindness, but maintained the careful distance that time had taught her. But Philadelphia, though a city of second chances, sometimes still whispered. At one gathering, as guests sipped wine and shared laughter, Elon overheard a cruel thread of conversation, a man speaking softly about Clara's past, framing her as a woman who had wandered too far for too long. Elon, without raising his voice, crossed the room and joined the conversation. He didn't confront. He didn't accuse. He simply said, "Clara Whitmore has built a life defined by grace. I'm proud to stand beside her." The room quieted, the weight of his words settling. Clara, watching from across the room, caught his eye and smiled, not because he had defended her, but because he had done so with quiet dignity. It was Martin, though, who provided the night's more tangible scandal. Jilted by Vera, who had finally tired of his shallow gestures, Martin made a clumsy attempt to draw Clara into his bitterness. "She always knew how to run," he muttered to Vera, too loudly, too carelessly. Elon, calm and deliberate, placed a gentle hand on Martin's shoulder. "We've all grown, Martin. Let's leave each other room to do so." The moment passed without spectacle, but it left a mark, a clear line drawn between the life Clara had chosen and the one she had outgrown. When Clara's birthday arrived, the gathering was smaller, more intimate. Friends filled their home with quiet joy, and Clara moved among them with a warmth that made the space feel like an extension of her heart. Elon watched her that night with a tenderness he could not have explained. She laughed freely, but there was still a flicker behind her eyes, a question she had yet to ask aloud. Later, when the guests had gone and the last candle had burned low, Clara sat beside him on the couch, dog curled between them. "I'm afraid," she said softly. "Afraid of losing who I am. Afraid I've traded the woman who chased the night for the woman who folds laundry before dinner." Elon turned to her, brushing a stray tendril of hair from her cheek. "You're more yourself now than you've ever been. You didn't lose her, you brought her home." She rested her head against his shoulder, his words wrapping around her like the softest blanket. Dog, weaving in and out of their gatherings, had become more than a pet. He had become the heartbeat of their home, the living symbol of what had endured. That evening, long after the house had fallen silent, Clara stood by the window, her gaze lingering on the city lights. Elon, drawn by the soft thread of melody, found her there, singing Fields of Gold, not for a crowd, not for anyone else, but just for him. Her voice was not polished, but it was honest, carrying the weight of every step, every choice, every part of her that had once feared stillness. Elon approached her slowly, his chest aching with a quiet, overwhelming gratitude. He didn't interrupt. He simply wrapped his arms around her from behind, holding her as her song gently faded. When she finished, she leaned back into him, her silence speaking volumes. Their love had become less about grand gestures and more about these quiet, layered moments, the steady rhythm of lives lived in tandem. Philadelphia, the city that had once been Clara's hiding place, now embraced them as one of its own. Neighbors who once watched them with curiosity now welcomed them with warmth. Their story, woven into the fabric of the community, had become something that people admired, not for its perfection, but for its honesty. Their relationship, once fragile, now stood steady. Not immune to life's winds, but strong enough to sway and return to stillness. And in the hush of their shared nights, surrounded by the simple, tangible pieces of their life together, a well-loved sofa, a dog's soft breath, the echo of a familiar song, Clara and Elon found something they hadn't dared hope for in the beginning. They had not just built a life, they had built a home. Philadelphia's streets, once crowded with Clara's restless footsteps and Elon's quiet uncertainty, now carried the rhythm of their chosen life. Elon, no longer consumed by proving himself, found joy in something he never expected: mentorship. He began guiding new startups across the city, offering the kind of patience and steady wisdom that had once eluded him. The same man who had chased impossible dreams now paused to help others find their footing. In conference rooms and coffee shops, young founders leaned into his soft-spoken advice, his words carefully measured and generously offered. Clara, too, had found her own place of belonging. She volunteered a local shelter, her days filled with the laughter of children learning their first notes, their clumsy chords and hesitant melodies stitched with joy. She taught them not to fear wrong notes, not to fear being heard. Music, she had realized, was less about perfection and more about the courage to keep playing. Bailey, Banks, and Biddle, the place where their story had once quietly bloomed, became more than a symbol. The shop invited Elon to host a reading event, a gathering of aspiring startuppers who had followed his story and wanted to hear from the man who had built not only a company but a life anchored in something lasting. Clara sat in the front row, her eyes never leaving him as he spoke, not about wealth or expansion, but about patience, humility, and the power of staying. Claudia Stein, always the careful observer, caught the perfect moment, a soft photograph of Elon and Clara standing side by side near the mechanical toy machine where their story had truly begun. Their faces carried the ease of people who had walked through storms together and found peace. She later slipped the photograph into Clara's hands, her voice low and kind. "You've come a long way." "Because I stopped running," Clara whispered. Martin Caldwell appeared that evening, his presence no longer sharp, no longer lingering at the edges of Clara's story. He approached with a quiet sincerity, his pride softened by time. "I was unfair to you," he said, meeting her gaze. "I resented what I didn't understand." Clara's smile was not triumphant, it was forgiving. We both lived lives we didn't quite know how to hold. There was no grand reconciliation, only a gentle acceptance that some people are meant to be released with kindness. Vera, too, found her way back to herself. The bitterness that had once shadowed her steps had lifted, replaced by a quiet peace. She no longer sought the approval of those who never really knew her. She simply chose to stay rooted, steady, and finally at home. On one particularly cool evening, as they walked the familiar streets near Washington Square, Elon and Clara spoke of what would come next, not as a distant dream, but as a life that stretched comfortably before them. "I don't want to live in maybe anymore," Elon said softly. "I want to build a life that doesn't hold its breath." Clara's steps slowed, her fingers brushing his. "I think I'm ready to stand still." That night, in the quiet warmth of their apartment, Elon reached for a small velvet box that had once belonged to his father. Inside rested a diamond, not extravagant but carefully preserved. It had been passed down quietly, not as a gesture of status, but as a symbol of continuity. "I want you to have this," he said, placing the box in her palm. "It's yours if you want it. Not because we need to mark something, but because I choose you. Always." Clara's breath caught. Her heart, long accustomed to hesitating, faltered once more. "It's beautiful," she said, her voice trembling. "But I don't know if I need it. You're enough. You've always been enough." He smiled gently. "There's no need, Clara. Only choice." Later that evening, as the city settled into its quiet lull, they walked together to Bailey Banks and Biddle under the soft glow of streetlights. The shop was closed, its windows glowing faintly, but they lingered there anyway, as if the walls themselves still remembered them. Clara turned to Elon, carefully placing the diamond ring in his hand. "I don't need to wear this to know what we have. Your love is already the most precious thing I've ever been given." His fingers closed around the ring, not in disappointment, but in gratitude. She had never been one to follow the expected path. Her refusal was not rejection, it was affirmation. What they had was enough. More than enough. As they stood there, side by side, the staff inside caught sight of them through the glass. Recognition flickered, warm and familiar. They had become part of the shop's story now, a quiet legend of the couple who found love, not in grand purchases, but in the soft rituals of returning, of choosing each other again and again. Philadelphia, too, had begun to watch them differently. Their story, once a private thread, had quietly threaded its way into the fabric of the community. People spoke of them, the woman who sang on her fire escape, the man who read his words with care, the dog who wove through gatherings as if he had stitched the whole life together. Their love was no longer fragile. It had become something others looked to, not for spectacle, but for the simple reminder that healing is possible, that steadiness can bloom from uncertainty. As they walked home that night, dog trotting at their side, Clara slipped her hand into Elon's, her touch light but certain. "We've been chasing treasure all this time," she said softly. Elon's smile deepened, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. "Turns out we've had it all along." Their life, quiet, imperfect, stitched with laughter and ordinary days, was the treasure they had chosen to keep. And as the city exhaled around them, their hearts beat to the same, steady rhythm. Elon had not expected to build a second company. He had thought he was finished with the chase, the relentless pursuit of proving his place. But this time, the idea didn't come from urgency. It came from life, from the soft, steady rhythm he had built with Clara. It was a company dedicated to helping others tell their stories, not with flashy headlines or polished campaigns, but with sincerity, with care. He named it Second Lines, a quiet nod to the lives rewritten, to the stories that begin again. Clara sat with him in the evenings, her pen often tapping against her lip in thought as she edited his drafts. She wove her life into the pages, reminding him of the overlooked moments, the pauses that matter more than the headlines. She didn't polish out the imperfections. She left them there, like brushstrokes on canvas, beautifully human. Philadelphia soon noticed. A local newspaper profiled them under the headline, "Couple Rewrites Love in Philadelphia." The story captured not just their history, but their present, how Elon mentored young startuppers who lined up for his advice, how Clara opened her home and heart to budding musicians who sought refuge in her guidance. The article painted them not as people who had arrived, but as people who had stayed, who had chosen the same life, the same love, over and over again. Bailey Banks and Biddle, forever entwined in their journey, hosted a special exhibition dedicated to their story. It wasn't grand or ostentatious. It was a quiet corner of a store where visitors could see photographs, well-worn journals, copies of Elon's website stories, and Clara's handwritten music sheets. Her notes always a little slanted, her words always carrying the rhythm of her own heartbeat. There was even a small, aged mechanical toy machine displayed with gentle reverence, a nod to the day their hearts first turned toward each other. The shop had become more than a store. It had become a museum of their quiet victories. At home, they began hosting Thanksgiving dinners, their table filled with neighbors who had once been strangers. There were no strict seating charts, no elaborate menus, just the warmth of shared food and shared stories, the sound of laughter echoing in their brownstone long after dessert had been cleared. Clara's rendition of Fields of Gold began to play softly at community events, her voice woven into the fabric of their gatherings. It wasn't a performance anymore. It was a part of the city's breath, a song that belonged to everyone who had found their way home. One evening, as the first snow kissed the city streets, Elon presented Clara with a journal, a simple, leather-bound book. Inside, he had filled the pages with poetry, with unfinished lines of music, with sketches of their quiet life. On the very first page, he had written, "This is not a beginning. This is where we've always been heading." Clara traced her fingers over his handwriting, her heart full. That night, she added her own line at the bottom of the page. "Together we're home." Their evenings folded gently into each other, Elon writing, Clara singing softly as she tidied the kitchen or sketched out new lessons for her music students. Sometimes they played together, her on the piano, him on the cello, their melodies weaving into something both playful and tender. They laughed easily now. They didn't fill silences out of fear. They let the quiet settle around them like a familiar blanket, knowing it was not absence, but presence in its softest form. Philadelphia glowed outside their window, the streetlights blinking gently, the city embracing them as one of its own. They watched the seasons turn together, the soft blush of spring, the golden spill of autumn, the hush of winter, and found comfort in the constancy of shared days. One night, as they sat side by side, their legs stretched out, dog napping contentedly between them, they realized they had built something that surpassed what they once thought possible. Their love had outgrown their wildest hopes. Clara turned to him, her voice a soft confession in the quiet. "You made me believe," she whispered. Elon's hand found hers, his thumb brushing over her knuckles in that familiar, steady rhythm. "No," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We made each other whole." It was not a fairy tale. It was not a story without scars. It was instead something far more precious, a life stitched together with patience, with honesty, with the choice to stay even when the doors to escape had been wide open. Their home, their love, their place in the city's heartbeat, these were not accidents. These were the quiet treasures they had chosen, day after day. And as the snow continued to fall beyond their window, as the soft tick of the clock marked the hush of evening, Clara and Elon leaned into each other, their story still unfolding, not as something to be chased, but as something to be lived. The invitation arrived on a soft cream card, the ink carefully pressed, its edges embossed with golden vines. A Philadelphia gala, an evening to honor those whose quiet influence had touched the city's heart. Elon and Clara were named among the honorary guests, their story now known beyond the quiet corners of their brownstone and the familiar paths of Washington Square. Clara, upon reading it, traced her finger along the words, her chest tightening not with fear, but with disbelief. Once she had fled from recognition, from permanence. Now she was walking toward it, hand in hand with the man who had taught her to stay. The ballroom shimmered under the weight of crystal chandeliers, the walls humming with the soft rustle of silk gowns and polished shoes. Elon stood on the stage, his voice steady, his presence no longer overshadowed by his father's name or the pressure of expectation. He spoke not of success, but of love, the kind that waits, the kind that forgives, the kind that patiently rebuilds. "I have learned," he said, his voice resonant, "that love is not the lightning strike, it is the steady flame. Is the second chance we offer, and the third, and the fourth. Is the quiet vow to stay when every door is open to leave." The room held its breath. Clara, seated near the front, felt the weight of his words settle into her bones, into the corners of her memory where old fears once lived. She rose slowly when called, stepping onto the stage, her hazel eyes catching the soft glimmer of the piano waiting for her. She had chosen Fields of Gold once more, not as a nostalgic echo, but as her own anthem, her own offering. This time, her voice was steady, clear, no longer trembling under the burden of uncertainty. Each note drifted like sunlight through the room, brushing the faces of the listeners, drawing them into her story. By the second verse, people began to stand, drawn not by spectacle, but by the honest beauty of the moment. The melody wrapped around them, gentle but resolute, as if the city itself paused to listen. Elon, standing at the edge of the stage, watched her with a pride that warmed his entire being. She had come home to herself, and he had witnessed every step of the way. Among the crowd, Martin and Vera exchanged soft smiles, their friendship with Clara no longer caught in the tangled threads of the past, but woven anew with tenderness and patience. When the last note faded, Clara lowered her hands from the keys, her breath steady, her heart full. The applause rose like a wave, but she no longer needed its validation. What she needed, what she cherished, was waiting for her offstage, his hand outstretched, his eyes shining. They returned home that night not as two people who had been lifted by the world, but as two people who had quietly chosen each other again and again. Their brownstone glowed softly in the cool evening air, its familiar walls welcoming them as only a true home could. In their bedroom, Clara carefully polished the small ring from Bailey Banks and Biddle, the one Elon had once offered her in the simplest of gestures, the one she had returned only to later carry in her pocket like a talisman. Its shine had softened over time, but its meaning had deepened, a symbol not of possession, but of enduring joy. As she traced its delicate edge, Clara reflected on the long, winding path that had brought her here. She had once run from everything, fame, friendship, love, convinced she was safer as a moving target. Yet here, in the stillness of their life, she had found the treasure she had chased in 1,000 cities. Elon sat by the window, his pen moving steadily across the pages of his worn journal, the quiet scratch of ink filling the room. His latest speech, simple and true, "Love that waits is love that grows." He paused, glancing at Clara, his chest swelling with quiet reverence. She was his proof. A few nights later, they hosted a small dinner, their table surrounded by the faces that had remained through every twist and return: Vera, Martin, Claudia, and a few new friends who had quietly found their place in their story. The conversation flowed easily, threaded with laughter and soft stories, with gratitude for the roads that had once diverged and now converged at this simple table. There were quiet tears, too, Vera's voice cracking as she spoke of forgiveness, Claudia pressing her fingers to her lips when words failed, Martin offering a hesitant but sincere toast to second chances. When the time came, Elon raised his glass, his voice gentle but firm. "To love's patient journey," he said, his eyes resting on Clara's. "To the roads that led us home." Glasses touched. The soft chime of crystal filled the room, the candlelight flickering across their joined hands, resting together on the table's edge like they always belonged there. As the evening drifted toward its close, the guests lingered, reluctant to leave the warmth, the weight of what had been shared. Elon and Clara stood at the door, bidding their friends good night, their hearts impossibly full. When the last guest stepped into the night, Elon closed the door softly, the hush of their home wrapping around them like a cherished song. Clara turned to him, her voice no louder than a breath. "You made me believe." Elon cupped her face, his thumb brushing the delicate curve of her cheek. "We made each other whole." The words hung between them, soft as silk, steady as the life they had chosen. And as they curled into each other on their well-loved sofa, dogs settling at their feet, the final note of the evening was a shared whisper. Always. And for them, that was enough. The anniversary arrived softly, almost as if it had crept up on them, woven into the rhythm of their days. 1 year since Elon's website went live. 1 year since Clara chose to stay, to build, to love without escape routes. The date held weight, not as a trophy, but as a quiet milestone, a whispered reminder of all they had survived and all they had created. They didn't plan a grand celebration. That had never been their way. Instead, they agreed to return to the place that had been both a beginning and a constant, Bailey Banks and Biddle. It had become a private tradition, a sacred ritual stitched into their story. Clara knew they would browse, perhaps smile, at the mechanical toy machine that still sat quietly near the entrance. She expected gentle conversation, maybe another memory tucked away. What she didn't expect was the envelope Elon pressed into her hands as they sat by the shop's sunlit window, sipping their usual blue tea. Inside, carefully printed, was the blueprint for his next venture, a company he called Zip 2. It was his most ambitious work yet, his step into the growing world of internet startups. Clara's fingers trembled slightly as she read, her hazel eyes lifting to meet his with a shimmer of pride and wonder. "You're really going to do this?" she whispered, her voice soft but full of certainty. Elon's smile was humble but sure. "Not without you." She set the papers down carefully, her hand finding his. "You're building it, but I can see my footprints in the margins." "You've always been there," he said, "even in the things I didn't yet know how to reach." They lingered there, surrounded by the quiet elegance of the shop, reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this quiet table. From their whirlwind beginnings, the accidental meetings, the prison visits, the escape attempts, to the tender reunions, the tears, the fire escape melodies, the Thanksgiving tables filled with laughter. Each chapter now flickered like soft film frames in their shared memory. Clara's voice broke the stillness. "You gave me love without chains. You never once asked me to be anything but who I was, whether I was running, pausing, or still learning how to stay." Elon's hand tightened over hers. "And you," his voice softened, "you taught me how to be vulnerable, how to build without walls, to trust that I wouldn't collapse if I leaned." Their tea cooled between them, but neither minded. They sipped slowly, the soft taste of blue tea a quiet companion to their gratitude. Outside, the Philadelphia skyline shimmered as dusk began to settle, the golden hour wrapping the city in its familiar, tender light. It was the same skyline that had once witnessed Clara's hurried steps, Elon's uncertain mornings, and now it held them gently, two people who had outlasted their own fears. Later, back at their brownstone, the evening unfolded with simple beauty. No crowds, no grand speeches, just music drifting through the air as Elon held Clara close, their bodies swaying slowly to a rhythm known only to them. Dog curled beneath their feet, a silent witness to their devotion, his steady breath keeping pace with their quiet dance. Clara's voice was little more than a breath against Elon's chest. "Our love remains." Elon kissed her forehead, his reply carrying the weight of every promise they had ever made. "Always." They danced long after the music faded, the softness of their steps echoing in the quiet rooms of their home. When they finally settled into the sofa, their hands still linked, Elon shared the last piece of his vision, the next chapter he had been quietly sketching for them both. "I've been thinking," he began, "if Zip 2 takes off the way I believe it can, the epicenter of technology is shifting to California. It's where the next frontier is building." Clara tilted her head, curiosity blooming. "You want to move?" "I want us to move," he said carefully. "Not to leave this life behind, but to let it grow, to see what we can build in new soil." Clara didn't answer immediately. She let the thought settle, feeling the weight of their home, their friends, the city that had finally become a part of her. But then she looked at him, the man who had given her every chance to choose, who had never once asked her to shrink to fit his dreams. She smiled, the answer written in the quiet certainty of her gaze. "Where you build, I'll build. Where you stay, I'll stay. Home isn't a place anymore. It's us." His chest ached with the fullness of her words. "California," she continued, her voice light, "might have the startups, but I'll bring the music." He laughed softly, the sound warm and unguarded. "Then we'll carry Philadelphia with us, in every note, in every story." The plans would unfold slowly, as everything in their life now did, with patience, with care, with the quiet understanding that they had already built their greatest treasure, each other. And as the night wrapped around them, as dog nestled closer and the hum of their city lulled them into the peace of shared silence, they both knew. Wherever they would go, whatever would come next, they had already found the kind of love that didn't need grand declarations. Their love had simply remained. It had stayed. It always would. The walls of their Philadelphia brownstone echoed with the sound of carefully folded boxes, the soft rustle of newspaper wrapping treasures they couldn't bear to leave behind. Books, journals, Elon's scribbled notes, Clara's sheet music, all now packed and labeled with neat handwriting, as if the life they had built could be safely folded into cardboard and carried across the country. The decision had been Elon's, born not from dissatisfaction, but from a quiet pull towards something new. Palo Alto, he said, was calling a place where the rhythm of possibility thrummed in the very air, where he could build something that would matter. Clara listened as he laid out his vision, his eyes alight with a familiar fire. Zip2, he called it a city directory service that would live on the internet, helping local businesses find their place in an increasingly connected world. He would co-found it with his brother, Kimball. "This is it, Clara," Elon told her, one hand resting over hers at their small kitchen table. "The beginning of something that could change how people move through cities, how they find each other." Clara, who had once fled from permanence, found herself nodding. "Then we build it. Together." They left Philadelphia in the soft hush of a winter morning, their car filled with boxes and quiet goodbyes. Their story there wasn't ending, it was simply shifting to a new verse. When they arrived in Palo Alto in 1996, the streets buzzed with the understated energy of budding tech culture. Their new home was modest, its pale exterior weathered but charming. They filled it with what they had carried: stacks of books, teacups, Clara's carefully folded music sheets, and the small ring from Bailey Banks and Biddle that still glistened faintly in Clara's keepsake box. They spent afternoons wandering the Stanford campus, the paths still damp from early spring rain, dreaming aloud about the life they were now assembling from scratch. Elon spoke of coding languages and system maps. Clara spoke of small music studios and the kind of songs that linger in the corners of coffee shops. At night, their kitchen table transformed into Elon's command post. His fingers moved feverishly across his keyboard, sketching the first digital blueprints of Zip2. Clara brewed tea, the soft aroma of chamomile and mint filling the room, her quiet presence grounding him when his frustration flared. Sometimes she sang softly as he worked, a new melody, one she hadn't yet named. Her voice threaded through the clatter of keyboard strokes, a steadying sound that reminded Elon why he had come, why it mattered. Elon's nights were filled with code, diagrams, endless adjustments. But the venture began to draw attention. Through quiet whispers and unexpected introductions, word of his project reached the desks of early investors. More Davido Ventures soon surfaced as a possible partner, a name that sent ripples through the tight-knit tech community. But with interest came pressure, and with pressure came doubt. On more than one occasion, Elon arrived home from a meeting with his shoulders heavy, his belief shaken. "What if I'm chasing the wrong thing?" he confessed one night, collapsing into the chair beside her. "What if I can't build it?" Clara, who had once lived her entire life on the verge of leaving, reached for his hand and held it tightly. "You're not chasing, you're building. And even if it doesn't become what you imagine, it will still matter." Her words steadied him. With her belief tucked safely in his pocket, Elon returned to the keyboard, refining the prototype that would allow local businesses, corner bakeries, family-owned bookstores, to find a home online, a radical notion in 1996. Their modest home became a hub of creative energy. Elon hunched over his laptop, his face lit by the blue glow of his screen, while Clara sat nearby with her sheet music, singing softly, fields of gold finding its way back into their rhythm. They began hosting informal dinners for the small team that gathered around Zip2. The meals were simple, bowls of pasta, fresh bread, shared bottles of wine, but the conversations stretched deep into the night. Dreams, fears, laughter, it all spilled across their kitchen table, weaving a culture that was as much about heart as it was about code. In the early mornings, when the streets were still quiet, Elon and Clara would walk through the sleepy neighborhoods, sometimes speaking, sometimes wrapped in a comfortable silence, always returning to the understanding that this chapter, too, belonged to both of them. The fusion of their worlds, technology and music, precision and feeling, became the pulse of Zip2's young culture. Elon's determination was relentless, but was Clara's quiet steadiness that gave the venture its soul. As 1997 approached, the letter arrived, a formal commitment from More Davido Ventures, a $3 million investment. The first true validation that what they were building had captured more than attention, it had captured belief. Elon, usually composed, set the letter on the table, with trembling hands. Clara smiled, pressing her palm to his cheek. It was always possible. When they danced that night in their small living room, the air smelled faintly of tea and fresh ink. They didn't need champagne. They didn't need applause. They moved slowly, swaying to song that only they could hear, their feet brushing the worn rug, dog curled at their feet. Elon's forehead rested against Clara's, his voice soft. "Thank you for coming with me." "Thank you for letting me stay," she whispered back. They had carried Philadelphia with them, not just in their boxes, but in the quiet rituals that remained. Blue tea, handwritten notes, the melody of fields of gold still floating in their home. This was their next chapter, not a departure, but a continuation. And in the warmth of that moment, they both knew they had already built the most enduring thing of all. The virtual offices of Zip2 slowly began to fill, not just with computers and code, but with the pulse of people who believed in something new. Elon and his growing team worked tirelessly to bring local newspapers and small businesses online, helping them step into a digital world that, for many in 1996, still felt distant and uncertain. Each time a new client signed on, Clara would mark the moment with quiet celebration, sometimes a candle lit during dinner, sometimes a gentle cheer as she placed a small gold star on a corkboard in their modest kitchen. It was her way of honoring the building blocks, the milestones that weren't always loud but were always essential. Elon met regularly with reporters and investors, his ambition unmistakable but always wrapped in humility. Whenever his work was praised, his answer remained the same: none of this would exist without Clara. She gave me the steady ground I didn't know I needed. Clara, never one to seek the spotlight, continued to build their own quiet legacy. She hosted music nights in their home, her soft melodies floating through rooms filled with neighbors, colleagues, and the occasional startup dreamer who found refuge in the Whitmore home. It wasn't the grand gatherings of Philadelphia socialites, it was something better. It was real, intimate, filled with warmth and the comfort of being known. Zip2's revenue grew steadily, its success driven by Elon's tireless coding, his intuitive grasp of the future, and the heartbeat of those late nights spent hammering out details at the kitchen table while Clara brewed tea and hummed softly in the background. One evening, they sat together on the porch, sipping their familiar blue tea, the air fragrant with eucalyptus from the Palo Alto streets. "Do you ever miss it?" Elon asked. "Philadelphia, the brownstone, the shop windows." Clara's smile was soft, her gaze distant. "I miss the beginning. The part where we didn't know what would happen, when everything was raw and new." He brushed his thumb over the back of her hand. "It still feels that way sometimes." Clara retrieved a small article clipped from a local newspaper, her hazel eyes shining as she read aloud. Zip2, a pioneering web guide reshaping how local businesses find their voice online. Her voice trembled as she finished. "You did it." "We did it," Elon corrected gently. They strolled through the quiet Palo Alto streets that night, their fingers intertwined, the sky above them thick with stars. They walked slowly, pausing often, not because they were tired, but because they wanted to linger, to taste the quiet, to remember the days when the only audience was the tick of a kitchen clock. Elon laughed softly, recalling those first frantic weeks. "I coded in old sweatshirts, living on energy drinks and whatever you made me in the middle of the night. I don't think I would have survived without your tea and those terrible muffins." "They weren't terrible," Clara teased, bumping his shoulder. "They saved me," he said, and his voice, though playful, carried the weight of truth. But as the months passed and Zip2 attracted attention from larger companies, the pace quickened. Elon often struggled to find the line between relentless dedication and quiet collapse. It was Clara who gently coaxed him toward balance, reminding him that rest was not a betrayal of ambition, but its foundation. "Your work will matter more," she whispered one night as she drew him away from his desk, "if you carry a heart that isn't empty." The talks with Compaq began quietly, threads of possibility woven through boardroom meetings and long phone calls. When the offer finally came, $300 million, Elon barely reacted at first. Success, he had learned, was less about the number and more about what it meant to the people who had built it with him. Clara's arms wrapped around him when the news settled. She buried her face against his chest, tears of joy falling freely. You built something from nothing, from that tiny kitchen table in Philadelphia. Elon held her close, his throat thick with emotion. You believed when I didn't. That made all the difference. They celebrated that evening not in some grand venue, but at a gathering in their home, where the team that had built Zip2 laughed and clinked glasses, their faces alight with the quiet, proud exhaustion of people who had given everything. Clara, never one to grandstand, prepared a brief musical tribute, a gentle, acoustic rendition of Fields of Gold that filled the room with soft reverence. Elon watched her sing, the notes wrapping around him like memory, like a story they had been writing all along. When the final chords settled into silence, he crossed the room, pulled her into his arms, and whispered, "From a humble kitchen to this, our love was the constant." Clara's reply, soft against his ear, was everything. Our love made this possible. They danced as the evening slipped toward midnight, swaying slowly among friends and colleagues, their feet brushing across the well-worn wooden floor. When the night finally drew to a close, Elon and Clara stepped onto their small Palo Alto balcony, the valley's soft glow stretching out before them like a promise. Elon exhaled, his gaze fixed on the horizon. There's so much more ahead. Clara leaned into him, her hand resting over his heart. We'll build it, but we'll build it like we always have. With steady hands, with music in the background, with tea at dusk. He turned to her, his voice steady and sure. That's the only way I want to build. They stood there, shoulder to shoulder, the cool night wrapping around them, as gently as memory. Their journey would continue, new ventures, new cities, new stories. But beneath it all remained the quiet strength of what they had always chosen. A life built not just on ambition, but on love, on patience, on the soft, steady hum of belonging. What they had built together was already more than enough. And somehow, it was only the beginning.